Bonjour, buenos dias, good morning, ni hao, sin chao, what's up? It's me, Mr. Jordan. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 35 of The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. So first off, we're going to do a brief recap and summary of the chapter. Then we'll get into the closer line-by-line reading and do a closer analysis of some extracts and quotes. And finally, we'll finish with the vocabulary along with the context and definition. Brief recap and summary of chapter 35 from The Handmaid's Tale. The chapter begins with the handmaid, Offred, back in her room, and she narrates for us the story of her past life when her and her ex, Luke, along with their daughter, made a sort of run for it to try and escape the impending doom of the new regime in Gilead. And we're told that they got stopped at the border, presumably the Canadian border, so the northern border of the former United States of America. And because that their passports weren't properly processed, or Luke had gone through a divorce and they weren't lawful under the new rules of Gilead, they were turned back. And at that point, we're told she literally made a run for it. So this woman was running through the woods with her daughter. There's then a short section of Offred again in the commander's office, and they're discussing love. And this sort of turns into her own reflection and ponderance of what love means and the concept of love, sort of the Western notion of falling in love or being deeply in love, whether it's a passionate feeling or something that is a deeper or spiritual connection, like this idea of the love of God, or the love that comes through a soul, or having a higher purpose or being, like a sort of enlightened. She continues on with this philosophizing by thinking about the idea of free will and how much choice they used to have, and this idea that the world used to sort of be limitless or boundless when she was living in Western-style democracy that the United States had been, and how much had changed and how rapidly in Gilead. And then she tells us literally that we have to forgive her because she's a refugee, or she feels like a refugee. Even though she's in the same physical landscape where she once was, she's in refuge from past life, from that old history and that old way of being. And then right at the end of the chapter, her sort of reverie or her moments where she's looking back are interrupted by Serena Joy. And Serena Joy finally brings her the promised photo of her daughter. And this photograph, this memento of the past in the present, connects the two, right? It connects her story of running away and escape with her daughter to the reality that even though she's in Gilead and she's a refugee from the past, her daughter is still out there and still exists. And this photograph, of course, will give her hope. First moment, she's in the car and they're at the border and they've been stopped. This is in the past in the US, and presumably the late 80s or early 90s, whenever the regime of Gilead took over. And they've realized that their border run to Canada is failing, right? They're not going to be able to escape like people on the Underground Railroad before them, or like all the Vietnam War resistors who came up to Canada. This has failed. So we're told, "It's going to be all right," I said, prayed in my head. "Oh, let it. Let us cross. Let us across. Just this once, and I'll do anything. What I thought I could do for whoever was listening that would be of the least use or even interest, I'll never know." So this moment of crossing the threshold, or of course the reference to crossing yourself, and to let us across, i.e. across the border of the United States to Canada, that moment also represents for her crossing into the world of belief, right? She's praying, please, on the cross, bowing herself, prostrating herself before the cross. And when that doesn't come true, and she loses her daughter, this, of course, acts as reinforcement that she shouldn't believe in Gilead, and she should distrust their idea that there's a higher being out there looking after her. Quote, "Then Luke got back into the car, too fast, and turned the key and reversed. He was picking up the phone," he said, and then he began to drive very quickly. "And after that, there was the dirt road and the woods, and we jumped out of the car and began to run. A cottage to hide in, a boat. I don't know what we thought. He said the passports were foolproof and we had so little time to plan. Maybe he had a plan, a map of some kind in his head. As for me, I was only running, away, away. I don't want to be telling this story. This gives us a really interesting insight to Offred as a narrator, right? Where she breaks down the fourth wall and addresses us, the reader or the audience, telling us, I don't want to be telling this story. So the idea is, this really is some sort of survivor narrative, right? That she's recorded herself or written it down. And so it puts this greater perspective on the book that this document we're reading is somehow parallel to, the diary of Anne Frank during the Holocaust, right? That she feels she has to be telling the story about her escape or her failed attempts at escape, and that these stories are important and relevant as historical documents for those in the future to understand the mistakes of the past. And this, of course, this references all these different survivors from the Holocaust, Solzhenitsyn writing after his experience in the Gulag and the Gulag Archipelago, that these stories are important and that they must be told. I don't have to tell it. I don't have to tell anything to myself or to anyone else. I could just sit here peacefully. I could withdraw. It's possible to go so far in, so far down and back. They could never get you out. But she doesn't give up. We know that because we know that she has written this story down. She has told her story. And I think for Atwood, that's a really important moment of significance and note that Offred, who sometimes seems like unable to act, right? Like if she has this character flaw, it's her passivity or her inability to actually take the final step of action, unlike her friend Moira. But this act of telling a story, is itself powerful and important and poignant and historically relevant. Next, we're going to look at a little piece of the chapter where the commander and Offred talk about love and love's sort of meaning or background or where the concept comes from. Love, said the commander? That's better. That's something I know about. We can talk about that. Falling in love, I said. Falling into it. We all did then, one way or another. So this idea of falling, right, is also this idea of taking a leap, of giving up control, right? Stepping off of a precipice into the unknown that is love. Allowing yourself some of the chaos of life, as opposed to the controlled, regimented, power hunger structure of Gilead. There's freedom and fear in stepping into the unknown of love and falling. How could he have made such light of it, sneered even, as if it was trivial for us, a frill, a whim? It was, on the contrary, heavy going. It was the central thing. It was the way you understood yourself. If it never happened to you, not ever, you would be like a mutant, a creature from outer space. Everyone knew that. So this idea that if you don't fall in love, if you were loveless or living a life without love, it would be like, like Milan Kundera and the incredible lightness of being. If you don't have love and passion to ground you to the physical reality of Earth and humanity, you drift off into nothing, into non-being. And that creature, that mutant, is of course a sociopath or a psychopath who's unable to experience love. Falling in love, we said. I fell for him. We were falling women. We believed in it. This downward motion, so lovely, like flying, and yet at the same time, so dire, so extreme, so unlikely. And it's this idea of love being part of the unknown or uncontrolled. Our inability to predict where love will take us, right? The same way it's impossible to know where your story or your narrative will take you. Like the fiction, right? A love story. God is love, they said once, but we reversed that. And love, like heaven, was always just around the corner. Again, this idea of holding out hope and looking to the future, and love sort of being the answer, or love being the reason for going forward. The more difficult it was to love the particular man beside us, the more we believed in love, abstract and total. So love here becomes the God, or it becomes the higher power or higher being. The enlightenment is love. It's the passion. Of course, there's also the allusion then to things like the passion of Christ, right? We were waiting, always, for the incarnation, that word made flesh. And so now we have a direct reference where we tie in this idea of God and love as being the same thing, right? Quite a beautiful passage. We believed in love, abstract and total. We were waiting, always, for the incarnation, that word made flesh. Finally, the third passage is a discussion of sort of free will and the openness or open choice. So Atwood's really delving into some deeper philosophical, contemplative ideas in this chapter. It's strange to remember how we used to think, as if everything were available to us, as if there were no contingencies, no boundaries. This is this idea of limitlessness, right? Of the infinite scope of possibility. And of course, of the idea of being your own author. In this same chapter where she says, I don't want to be telling this story, she refers to a time when she felt like she could write herself any story, like the paths before her were not chosen, and she could use her free will and judgment to narrate and to steer her own ship in the direction with which she chose. As if we were free to shape and reshape forever the ever-expanding perimeters of our lives. So again, a reference to the infiniteness, the infinite nature of choice, the fractaling nature of the world, where it keeps growing out, where life is not a zero-sum game. I was like that too. I did that too. Luke was not the first man for me, and he might not have been the last. If he hadn't been frozen that way, stopped dead in time, in midair, among the trees back there, in the act of falling. So this is that moment when they're caught, right? When Gilead and the thing they're running away from catches up to them and freezes them. She then tells us, you'll have to forgive me. I'm a refugee from the past. And like other refugees, I go over the customs and habits of beings I've left or been forced to leave behind me. This idea of customs and habits, right? She's talking about society and not only the social order, but the actual experience, which is made up of your values, your customs, your social norms, the behavioral cues. These have been shifted and changed. It all just seems quaint from here, and I'm just as obsessive about it. Like a white Russian drinking tea in Paris, marooned in the 20th century, I wander back, try to regain those distant pathways. I become too maudlin, lose myself, weep. Weeping is what it is, not crying. I sit in the chair and ooze like a sponge. So she gives us this direct historical reference to the sort of Russian aristocracy or the old thinking of Russia after the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution is, of course, the story of the rise of the Bolsheviks and socialism and communism that became the USSR. It's also the basis for George Orwell's story, Animal Farm. Great book. We read that as well, have some videos on it. I can cross-link those here. Now let's get into some vocabulary from chapter 35. Invalid. Alfred feels like an invalid, a person made weak or disabled by illness or injury. Remove someone from active service, disable someone. So she feels like a part of her has been cut off, like her ability to act has been stolen from her, taken from her. She's been injured, right? Physically. Pertinent. Relevant or applicable to a particular matter. Apposite. She asked me a lot of very pertinent questions. This idea of being relevant or referring to a certain thing. Contingent. Contingencies. Subject to chance of losses, liabilities that can be anticipated to arise if a particular event occurs. This is like X will happen if Y happens. It's an if that, then this. She was thinking about the time before contingencies, or when there were no contingencies, whereas now everything is dependent on choices of other people. Her life is the then that happens because the if that they took over Gilead. If they take over Gilead, nothing will ever be the same. Offred is contingent upon all of these other actions and choices by the regime which is subjecting her. Maudlin, self-pityingly or tearfully sentimental, of a book, film, or song. Highly sentimental. Derives from the allusion to pictures of Mary Magdalene weeping, i.e. the mother of Jesus. So there's an overall reference here to the chapter itself is a quite sentimental or maudlin one. It's the story of them running away and her losing her daughter. So in a very unorthodox narrative, it's quite an orthodox story that she tells us. It's also, when she tells us, she's telling a story, that she herself is a narrator, a storyteller. And so this is her sentimental story. And then also the Mary Magdalene reference refers back to that chapter about God being love, or sort of the section about God being love and the word of love and incarnation and the word made flesh. Thanks so much for watching. That was chapter 35, The Handmaid's Tale. Hope you liked the video. Have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I always appreciate it, and I'll get back to you right away. Thanks so much, and take care until chapter 36.